I ran freight for 41 years and I never once thought the job would put me in front of something from off this world. Freight is not that kind of work. Freight is tonnage and gradient and brake temperature. It is the smell of hot steel in the cuts and cold steel on the flats. It is a clipboard and a manifest and the discipline to know, at every hour of every run, exactly what you are carrying and exactly where it is going. That is the whole of it. That was the whole of me. My name is Halden Rowe. I was line master of the Kettle Spine, which is 3,400 miles of rail laid across the northern interior of this continent, from the Marrow in the west to the eastern apron at Toro, and I had walked or ridden or slept on nearly every mile of it. My father set ties on the spine. His mother poured the Marrow abutments. That is not remarkable. Half the families in the interior can say the same, because the spine has been there a long time, and it has been rebuilt more times than anyone bothers to count. And the thing about a rail is that it does not care who lays it. It only cares that somebody does. The order came down on the third night of the thaw, and it came the old way, over the wire, because the longkeep does not trust anything it cannot repair with its hands. Hitch the cold cars, run west, load out at Marrow Deep, bring them home. I read it twice. Then I sat in the line office at Toro with the stove ticking and my tea going cold, and I looked at that last sentence for a long while, because in 41 years of service I had never received an instruction that used the word them about cargo. Then the second wire came, and it explained. 912 hulls had come through the outer dark on a heading that did not curve. They were not hailing. They were not scanning, not the way a ship scans when it wants to be seen scanning. They were running dark and clean and confident, the way you run when you are going somewhere you have been before, and you expect to find it exactly as you left it. And the wire said, in the flat, unbeautiful language of a duty officer who has been awake too long, Ossaru, Rite-Fleet configuration, Marrowguard escort confirmed, estimated planetfall 6 days, they are coming for their dead. I want to tell you what I felt, and the honest answer is that I felt the way any man feels when the work he has done all his life is suddenly the work that matters. Not fear. Not pride either, though I would not have minded some. What I felt was a kind of settling, like a load shifting down onto its bolsters and finding its center. Because I knew what was in the marrow. Everybody on the spine knows what is in the marrow. We haul for it. We have always hauled for it. We had just never, in all that time, hauled out. Let me tell you about the Ossaru the way it was taught to me, which is the way it is taught to every child in the interior, in the winter school when the drifts are up over the sills and there is nothing to do but learn. 60,000 years ago they came here with a war host. That is what the record says, and the record is not a story, it is a record. It is bone and metal and ash and the careful, unglamorous handwriting of 60,000 years of people who wrote down what they saw. The Ossaru came, and they made war on us, and the war was not a war. A war has two sides. What happened here was closer to what a man does to a wasp nest under his eaves. It took them 9 years. When it was finished, there were fewer of us than there are people in the town of Toro today, and they were living in the wet valleys of the south, and they were eating what they could catch, and they had forgotten how to make anything that would last longer than a season. The Ossaru did not stay. This is the part that is important, and it is the part that every child asks about, and it is the part for which we have no good answer, only the true one. The ice was coming. The long kettle, we call it. The world went white from the pole down to the middle latitudes, and it stayed that way for a long, long time, and the Ossaru, who came from somewhere warm, somewhere they have never told us about, looked at that advancing white and decided the prize was not worth the winter. So they left. Their fleet lifted from the ice margin and it went home. And they left their dead. 11,406 of them. That is not a number I am reciting from a plaque. That is a number I have signed for, on a manifest in my own hand, with the wind coming off the marrow ice and getting under my collar. They left them where they fell mostly, some in ranks where a line had held, some scattered along the ice margin where the last withdrawal had gone badly, some sealed in their own machines, which had frozen and then been buried and then been ground down under a mile of ice, and then, 40,000 years later, come back up out of the melt like stones out of a plowed field. They left them because the ice was coming, and the dead do not weigh nothing. And we kept them. I need you to understand that this was not a decision. There was no council. There was no vote. There was nobody left in any condition to hold a council, and for the first 2,000 or 3,000 years after the Ossaru left, there was nobody left in any condition to do much of anything except survive the winter and bury their own. But somewhere in there, and the archivists at Marrow Deep will argue about the century until they are hoarse, and I have listened to them argue, and I enjoy it, somewhere in there. Some woman or some man in the wet valleys of the South went up onto the cold margin where the invaders had died, and looked at what was lying there frozen in the blue, and did the thing that people do. They dug a hole, they put the body in it, they marked it. They did not know its name. They could not have pronounced its name. They marked it anyway, with a stone with a scratch on it, and the scratch meant one, and the next stone meant another one, and that is where the ledger of the Ossaru dead begins. Not in an archive, not in a vault, in a scratch on a stone in the freezing mud of a valley that has been under a lake for 30,000 years. Somebody at some point taught somebody else what the scratches meant, and that is the whole of it. That is the entire secret of this planet, and I have never understood why the Ossaru, in all their long memory, never learned it. The secret is not that we are strong. We were not strong. The secret is that we hand things on. We hand on the scratch and the meaning of the scratch, and we do it in the bad years harder than we do it in the good ones. And if you do that without stopping for 60,000 years, you will find, at the end of it, that you have accidentally become something that cannot be killed. By the time the ice began to pull back, the ledger was a real ledger. By the time the ledger was a real ledger, we had learned enough from the machines in the ice to make our own machines, and the making of machines is a habit like any other, and it compounds. By the time we could smelt what their hulls were made of, we had a name for every one of the 11,406, because their armor carried their names, and it had taken us 400 years to learn to read it, and we had spent those 400 years reading it. We washed them. That started early, and I cannot tell you why, only that a people who wash their own dead will eventually wash anybody's. We washed them in meltwater, and we wrapped them in what we had: hide, then linen, then better than linen, and we put them in boxes. And when the ice advanced again in the middle years, we picked up the boxes and we moved them, all of them, hundreds of miles south on sledges by hand over 4 generations. There are people who died on that move. There are songs about it, which are not very good songs, but they are ours. And when the ice went back for the last time and the marrow opened up, we took them home again, to the cold vaults, cut into the root of the mountain, where the temperature does not vary by half a degree in 10,000 years, and where the 11,406 have lain in numbered galleries ever since, each in a box of dark stone with a name cut into the lid, cut in their letters, not ours, because it was their name and not ours to translate. And every year on the first day of the thaw, an archivist walks the galleries with a lamp and reads the names aloud. All of them. It takes 6 days. When one archivist gets hoarse, another takes over. I have heard it. I have stood at the gallery mouth with my hat in my hands, and listened to a woman I have known since we were children read out the names of 11,406 creatures who came here to exterminate my species and did not quite finish. And I have thought, this is insane, and it is the only sane thing anyone has ever done. We kept them because you keep what you are given. That is all. That is the whole reason. The Ossaru gave us their dead and their machines and a mile of ice and a lesson, and we kept all 4. The cold cars were in the shed at Taro, and they had been in the shed at Taro, in one form or another, for a very long time. That is a strange sentence, and I will explain it. The cars themselves were not old. They had been rebuilt in my grandmother's time and refitted twice since, and their cooling plant was 2 years out of the yard. But there had been cold cars at Taro since there had been rail at Taro, and before there was rail, there had been a covered barn with sledges in it, and before the barn, there had been a stone shelter with the sledges under a tarp, and the reason was always the same reason. If the day ever comes, we do not want to be improvising. Nobody in my father's time expected the day. Nobody in his mother's time expected it. The cold cars were maintained the way a country maintains a coastal battery in a century with no wars, as a rite, half embarrassed, the young men joking about it while they did the work properly anyway. I had inspected those cars every spring for 41 years. I had signed 41 inspection sheets. I had never once believed I would load them. I loaded them. We hitched 46 of them behind two Mero-class haulers, and we ran the empty train west out of Toro on the fourth morning of the thaw, with the sun coming up behind us, and the whole eastern sky doing that thing it does over the apron, where the light catches the cradle rings, and you can see them plain in the daytime, two of them, crossing, each a bright hard line drawn across the blue from horizon to horizon, turning so slowly that you cannot see them turn, but you know it in your gut. I have looked at those rings my entire life. They are as ordinary to me as the weather. My great-grandfather helped pour the counterweight anchors at Taro when the first ring was still a scaffold and a rumor, and there is a photograph of him at the anchor mouth in a bad coat, squinting, unimpressed. That is the family expression. We are an unimpressed family. That morning I looked at the rings and I thought about 912 holes coming in dark on a heading that did not curve. And for the first time in my life, I looked at what my people had built, and I did not feel unimpressed at all. The Longkeep hulls came up out of the yards at Hearthstone on the second day of the run. I was in the cab of the lead hauler when it happened, drinking tea, watching the grade. The interior there is flat as a table for 200 miles, old lake bed, and the sky over it is enormous, and you can see weather 3 hours before it arrives. The engineer beside me, a young woman named Sable Corey, who had a way of tapping the brake gauge with one finger when she was thinking, and who is now dead, and I will get to that, said, "Line master." And I looked where she was looking. They came up through the cloud deck in the south like a range of mountains deciding to relocate. I want to be careful here, because I have heard men describe the Longkeep hulls in language that would embarrass a poet, and I do not intend to embarrass anybody, so I will be exact. A Longkeep hull is a little under 4 kilometers along its spine. It does not have a bow the way a ship has a bow. It has a face, a slab of gray composite the color of a winter sea, and behind the face the body of it thickens and thickens until it stops looking like a vessel and starts looking like a landform. When one lifts, it does not roar. The ones built at Hearthstone move on principles I do not understand and have never needed to, and the only sound is a pressure change, a kind of deep unhappiness in the air, and the tea in your cup goes still. 3 of them came up out of the cloud that morning, then 5 more. Then I stopped counting because the counting was making me stupid and I had a train to run. They went up through the blue and they stopped, at an altitude where the atmosphere is thin enough to give them a hard edge, and they hung there, and their shadows lay across the old lake bed in long gray bars, and our train ran through those bars one after another, sunlight and shadow, for the rest of the day. Sable Corey tapped the brake gauge with one finger and said quietly, "They're not moving." "No," I said. "Why aren't they moving?" "Because there's nowhere to move to," I said. "Everything's already where it needs to be." She thought about that. Then she said, "How long have they been where they need to be?" And I said, 60,000 years near enough. And I meant it as a joke, and I heard how it came out and neither of us laughed. Here is what the Ossaru expected. I know it now, from the record, from what was said on the apron and afterward. I will put it here because it belongs here, at the point in the story where they were still 6 days out and still certain. They expected a cold world in the last stages of a glaciation, or a warm one lately out of it, and they expected on that world a scatter of animals descended from the wet valley things they had cleared. They had a word for us. It does not translate as human. It translates roughly as the quarry of the low ground, and it is not a slur exactly. It is the word a farmer uses for rabbits. It is worse than a slur. A slur means you noticed. They expected the bone field on the ice margin to be untouched, because nothing that they had left alive on this planet was capable of moving 11,406 armored corpses, and because in 60,000 years the ice would have taken and given and taken again, and their dead would be lying under it in a rough band a few hundred miles long, and the recovery would be a matter of survey and heavy lift, and perhaps 8 months of patient work. They expected to have to clear the quarry off the ice margin first. The Marrow Guard was aboard for exactly that reason. 912 hulls, 106 of them mortuary vessels of the Rite, and the rest escort, because you do not send your Rite priests down onto a world with animals on it without men to keep the animals off them. They expected, in the plain and unexamined way that a man expects the sun, that this would be the 9th such recovery in their long history, and that it would go as the 8 before it had gone. And they came in on that heading that did not curve, and they broke out of the dark inside the orbit of the outer moon, and they found the sky full of something they had no word for. And I will tell you exactly what happened then, because it is the part everybody wants, and it is not what anybody wants it to be. Nothing happened. That is what we did. That was the answer, and it had been the answer for 400 years, and it was written down and drilled and argued over, and finally, when it came, executed by a great many disciplined people who were probably terrified. Nobody fired, nobody hailed, nobody moved. 912 hulls came through the outer system at war speed and found, waiting for them, in perfect parade order, in the exact places from which they could not be dislodged, a fleet that did not acknowledge that they had arrived. The cradle rings kept turning. The long-keep hulls hung in the daylight and cast their bars of shadow. On the ground, in Toro and in Hearthstone and in 600 towns along the spine, people got up in the morning and went to work, because that was the instruction, and because it was the truth. And out on the old lake bed, a freight train ran west with 46 empty cold cars and a line master with a manifest, because there was a job to do and it was already 3 days behind the season. I have thought about what that must have looked like from inside a Marrow Guard hull. To come armed for the extermination of animals, and to be met by a civilization that has looked directly at you and decided, on the evidence, that you are not currently the most urgent thing on its schedule. We did not do it to insult them. I want to be very clear. There were people at the Longkeep who wanted to insult them, and they were overruled. And the reason they were overruled is that the doctrine was written by archivists and not by soldiers. We did not fire because we did not need to. We did not hail because we had nothing to say yet. We went to work because the work was real. The dead had to come out of the marrow, and they had to come out properly, in the cold, in order, with the manifest read and signed at both ends. And that takes 6 days, and the fleet was 6 days out, and so the timing was not a gesture. It only looked like one. The marrow is the root of a mountain, and the mountain has no name in any language that is still spoken. It has a number. Everything at Marrow Deep has a number. That is the archivist's way, and I have come to like it. We ran the train in on the 5th day, up the long grade through the cuts where the rock is streaked with old ice, and the temperature dropped the way it always drops, and the cold cars sang on their trucks the way cold steel sings. At the gallery mouth, the rail runs straight into the mountain for 2 miles and comes out into a chamber that you cannot photograph. I have seen the photographs. They are all failures. The chamber is a mile long, and the ceiling is lost, and the walls are galleries, tier on tier, and in the galleries are the boxes. 11,406 boxes of dark stone. You come in on the rail at the floor of the chamber, and the boxes go up above you into the dark on both sides, and there are lamps, but they are small lamps, because the archivists say bright light is disrespectful, and I have never known whether they mean disrespectful to the dead or to the rock. Archivist Ren Tawley met the train at the loading floor. She had been reading names for 2 days by then, and her voice was gone. She wrote on a slate instead. She wrote, late. Thaw was late, I said. She wrote, I know, I meant you. We loaded for 31 hours. It is not delicate work, but it is exact work. Each box goes onto a cradle, the cradle onto a dolly, the dolly to the car. Each box is checked against the gallery number and the gallery number against the manifest, and the manifest is read aloud, name by name, by an archivist who has spent her life learning to pronounce a language whose speakers she has never met. Every name, out loud, as it goes onto the train. I want to tell you about the 4th hour, because that is the hour I think about. We had a young loader named Emmett, a big soft-handed boy from the Toro Yards, and around the 4th hour he set a box down wrong. Not badly. He clipped the corner of the cradle, and the box shifted maybe 2 inches, and the lid ground on the stone with a sound like a knife on a plate. The whole floor stopped, 140 people. Nobody said anything. Emmett stood there with his hands out and his face going red and then white, and then he did something I did not teach him and nobody taught him. He put his hand flat on the lid of that box, on the cut letters of a name he could not read, of a thing that had come here to kill everything he was descended from, and he said, I'm sorry. And Ren Tawley, who could not speak, wrote on her slate and held it up, and it said, he was told he would rest. Then the floor went back to work. That is what we are. That is the whole of the report. You can have all the rest of it, the rings, the hulls, the 4-kilometer spines and the yards at Hearthstone. You can have every kilogram of it, and you will not have understood anything unless you understand the boy with his hand flat on the lid saying sorry to a name he could not read. The Ossaru made planetfall on the 6th day, on the ice margin, 400 miles west of the Marrow, exactly where their dead had fallen. They came down in a broad crescent, the right vessels in the center and the Marrow Guard on the flanks, and their landing burned the snow off 6 square miles of moraine, and the meltwater ran gray. From the air it must have been magnificent. They have been doing this for a long time, and they do it with enormous seriousness. And they got out onto the ice margin with their survey instruments and their heavy lift and their 8 months of patient work planned, and they found nothing. Not ruin, not disturbance, not a looted field, nothing. Clean ice, clean moraine, clean rock. 60,000 years of geology and not one fragment of ossaric alloy in any of it, because we had taken every fragment, every buckle, every splinter of them out of that ground 400 years before, and catalogued it. And the last piece, a broken rank pin, Gallery 9, Tier 4, had come out of a gravel bar in a river 40 miles south in a year when my father was still setting ties. They stood on the empty ice for 11 hours. Then they did the thing that I think must have cost them more than anything else they did that week. They widened the search. Not because they thought the dead had moved, because a people who have never once had to consider that they might be wrong about the nature of a place will, when confronted with an absence, first assume they are standing in the wrong spot. They flew survey-wide, and the survey went east. And 400 miles east of the ice margin, the Ossaru Rite-Fleet of the 9th Return looked down from their survey craft and saw the kettle's spine. I have tried since to imagine it their way, and I do not think I can, and I think that failure is the most honest thing in this account. Try, you have come back to a world you cleared, you expect rabbits. And you see a line. It runs east and west, and it does not stop. It goes over the moraine, and it goes down the long grade, and it crosses the old lake bed dead straight for 200 miles, and it does not deviate for anything. And where the land would have made it deviate, the land has been cut, and the cuts are old. And in the cuts, you can see the strata of 40,000 years, and you can see, in that strata, 4 separate older cuts at 4 separate older grades. Because the line has been here through 4 separate ice advances, and it has been rebuilt each time in the same place, by people who did not stop. And the line goes east until the curvature of the world takes it, and it does not end there. It simply goes over the horizon. And if you follow it, and they followed it, it goes and it goes and it goes. And at the far end of it there is a city on an apron of poured stone 20 miles across. And out of that apron rise two anchors, and up from the anchors go two cables, and the cables go up out of the sky, and where they end there are the rings turning. And on the line running east to west, a small dark thing. They had seen the Longkeep hulls. They had been surrounded, silently, for 6 days, by an armed fleet that outmassed theirs, by a factor I have never had explained to me in terms I understood. Every ranking officer in the Rite-Fleet knew, by then, that they were not going to be permitted to leave except by permission. But the record, theirs, given to us later in their own hand, which is a thing I still cannot entirely believe, the record says that it was not the hulls. It was the rail. The Right Master's name was Ossaru, and by the reckoning we later worked out, he had held the 9th return in his family for 11 of their generations and had trained for the recovery of his fleet's dead since he was a child, and had never expected, in the ordinary way, to lead it. He was old. He had come out to the ice margin himself, in armor, on foot, and stood in the meltwater. His statement about the rail is 4 words long in his own language. Our archivists have argued about the translation for years now, because the Ossaru do not have a word that means civilization, and they do not have a word that means persistence, and what they have instead is a word that means the thing a river does to a stone, and it is a word they use for geological time. The best translation, the one Ren Tawley finally signed off on, is this. They have been here. Not they are here. Not they survived. He looked at a cut in a moraine with 4 older cuts under it, and at a straight line of steel running out past the edge of the world, and he understood in one motion, without instruments, without argument, that the animals he had cleared from the low ground had spent the entire ice doing exactly what he and his fathers had spent it doing, which is the one thing the Ossaru believed themselves alone in the galaxy able to do. They had kept faith with time. They asked then. They finally hailed on the 9th day, and the hail went to the Longkeep, and the Longkeep did what it had promised the archivists it would do, which was to say very little. The Longkeep transmitted a set of coordinates, a date, an hour, and a single line, in careful Ossaric, drafted by a committee of 11 and argued over for 2 centuries, and finally sent by a duty officer at 4 in the morning. The line was, "Bring your rights, they are not here, they are with us, come and sign for them." I have been told that "come and sign for them" was the contribution of an archivist named Bellin Rowe, who was some cousin of mine 400 years back, and who fought for it against people who wanted something grander. I believe it. It is a very Rowe kind of sentence. We are an unimpressed family. They came east. Not the fleet stayed on the ice margin and above it, because they were not fools and they knew what a hostage looks like even when nobody has said the word. But 11 right vessels came east, low and slow, following the rail, and where the rail went through the towns the people came out and stood along the fences and watched them pass over. Nobody cheered. That was the instruction, and it was also, I think, what people would have done anyway. You do not cheer at a hearse. And in front of them, half a day ahead, running east on the same line under the same sky, came my train. 46 cold cars, 11,406 boxes of dark stone, 2 haulers, a crew of 9, a clipboard. We ran the last 200 miles across the old lake bed, with the right vessels a smudge in the western sky behind us, and the Longkeep hulls hanging above in their long gray bars of shadow. And Sable Corey tapped the brake gauge with one finger and looked at the gauge, and did not look up at anything. "Line master," she said, "what do we say to them?" "Nothing," I said, "it's a delivery. They killed everybody. 60,000 years ago. Does that matter?" I thought about it for a long while, because it was a serious question, and she was a serious woman. It matters that we know exactly how many, I said. It matters that we can say all their names and they can't. That's the whole of what we've got. If we say anything else, we're saying it instead of that, and it isn't better. She ran the numbers on the grade for a while. Then she said, "That's cold." "That's freight," I said. Sable Corey died 4 months later in the ordinary way, in a yard accident at Hearthstone that had nothing to do with any of this. And there is nothing to be made of that. And I put it here because it is true, and because she was worth more than a line in somebody's account of aliens. We came into Taro Apron on the 14th morning at first light, and I brought the train down to a walking pace 2 miles out, the way you do when you are carrying something that will not tolerate being handled twice. And we came onto the apron with the sun on the poured stone, and the anchors going up on either hand, and the cables going up out of sight, and the rings crossing overhead in the pale blue, and the Lonkeep hulls standing in the sky over the eastern sea like a range that had come down for the day. And on the apron in a crescent were 11 Ossaru mortuary vessels, grounded, ramps down. And in front of the ramps, in armor, on foot, in the wind, stood Right Master Oruseth Callan and 400 of his order, and behind them the Marrow Guard, weapons slung, because they had been told to sling them and to their eternal credit had. I want to describe him, and I find that I resent having to, because everyone always wants the aliens described and nobody ever wants the loaders described. He was tall. Their armor is not like ours. It grows, or it is grown, and it is the color of a beetle's back, and it carries the name at the throat and the rank at the shoulder and nothing else. His face was not a face I could read, and I have not learned to read it since. His hands had 4 fingers, and the fingers were long, and there was old scarring across the backs of them. He watched my train come in, 46 cars. He watched them all the way past. Then the train stopped, and the brakes let go their pressure with that long, tired sigh that brakes make, and it was quiet on the apron except for the wind coming off the water. I climbed down out of the cab with the manifest under my arm, in my work coat, with my hat on, because it was cold, and I walked the length of my own train past every car to where the Right Master stood, and I stopped a respectful distance away, and I took off my hat, and I held out the manifest. It was 418 pages. It was heavy. My arm shook a little, and I want to say it was the weight. "Right Master," I said, 11,406, all present. Read at loading, 6 days, all names. They're cold and they're in order, and I'll want your signature at the bottom of the last page." I do not know if he understood a word of it in the moment. The translation came a beat behind, through the box on his shoulder, in a voice like a badly tuned string. He did not take the manifest. He stood in the wind on the apron of a world he had cleared. Under the rings his people had no name for, in front of a freight train crewed by 9 tired civilians, and he looked down at 418 pages held out to him by a railman with his hat off. And Right Master Oruseth Callan of the 9th Return, whose fathers had kept the right for 11 generations, asked me a question. The box on his shoulder rendered it flat and wrong, and I have been told since that the tone of it, in his own language, was not the tone of a commander at all. He said, "Who ordered this?"